The Hell Runners thought they owned Cedar Ridge after burning down the old Barbershop. 12 leather-clad bikers rolling through Main Street like conquering kings, leaving nothing but ash and fear in their wake. What they didn't know was that Frank Carter wasn't just any barber. He was a ghost from the shadows of naval special warfare, 30 years of lethal training hidden behind gentle hands and quiet smiles. When they came back to finish what they started, expecting to find a broken old man begging for mercy, they discovered something far more dangerous, a warrior who traded his uniform for scissors but never forgotten how to hunt. Some men retire from war. Others just change battlefields. The Hell Runners were about to learn the difference. Quick pause before we continue. Tell us where in the world you're watching from. And if you're loving stories like this, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. The Electric Clippers hummed their familiar tune as Frank Carter worked the stubble off Tommy Martinez's neck. The kid was 17, maybe 18, still had that uncertain look of boys trying to become men in a town that didn't offer many paths forward. "Keep your chin up, son," Frank said, his weathered hand steady despite 63 years of wear. "Posture matters. In everything." Tommy straightened in the red leather chair, watching Frank's reflection in the mirror. The old barber moved with quiet precision, each cut deliberate, economical. No wasted motion. The walls around them told stories, faded photographs of Marines, sailors, and soldiers from wars spanning decades. A small American flag hung above the cash register, edges worn but colors still true. "Mr. Carter," Tommy said, "my dad says you were in the Navy." Frank paused for half a second, barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for. "Long time ago. He says you were special forces or something. Your dad talks too much." Frank's tone carried no malice, just the gentle ribbing of a man who'd heard the whispers but never encouraged them. "Hold still." The afternoon sun slanted through the shop's front window, casting long shadows across the checkerboard floor. Frank's barbershop occupied a narrow slice of Main Street in Cedar Ridge, Arizona, population 2,847 and shrinking. The kind of place where everybody knew everybody, where handshakes still meant something, and where an honest day's work could still pay an honest man's bills. At least, it used to be that kind of place. The rumble started low, like distant thunder. Frank's hands never wavered as he cleaned the clippers, but his eyes shifted to the window. Tommy's reflection showed wide eyes and the kind of nervous energy that young men get when trouble announces itself with chrome and leather. 12 motorcycles rolled down Main Street in formation, Harley-Davidsons mostly, engines tuned loud enough to rattle windows 3 blocks away. The Hell Runners MC had been making these trips through Cedar Ridge more frequently over the past 6 months, each visit lasting longer, their presence growing bolder. Frank finished Tommy's haircut in silence. The kid paid his $8. Frank never raised his prices, not even when the economy went sideways, and hurried out the back door. Smart boy. His father had taught him well. The motorcycles parked in a diagonal line outside Murphy's Tavern, their riders dismounting with the casual arrogance of men who'd forgotten what consequences felt like. Cute patches and tattoos told their stories. Prison ink, club colors, the kind of resume that honest people crossed the street to avoid. Frank began sweeping hair from around the chair, each stroke measured and methodical. Through the window, he watched the bikers filter into Murphy's. The tavern had been struggling since the interstate bypass pulled traffic away from Main Street. Bill Murphy probably welcomed the business, even if it came with complications. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky the color of old blood. Frank closed the shop at 7:30, same as always. He locked the front door, checked the back exit, and walked the 6 blocks to his small house on Elm Street. Dinner was leftover meatloaf and green beans, eaten while reading a Tom Clancy novel he'd picked up at the library book sale. He was asleep by 10:15. The phone rang at 2:17 a.m. "Frank." Bill Murphy's voice cracked through the receiver. "You need to get down here. Your shop." Frank was dressed and out the door in 90 seconds. The orange glow was visible from 4 blocks away, dancing against the low clouds like some ancient signal fire. By the time he reached Main Street, the volunteer fire department was already hosing down the neighboring buildings, trying to contain the blaze that had been Frank's barbershop. Sheriff Pete Holbrook stood beside his cruiser, radio squawking with dispatcher chatter. He nodded grimly as Frank approached. "I'm sorry, Frank. They got it good." The building that had housed 3 generations of barbers was gone. 47 years of photographs, tools, memories, reduced to smoke and ash. The red leather chair where Tommy Martinez had sat just hours earlier was a twisted skeleton of metal springs and charred foam. Security cameras? Frank asked, though he already knew the answer. Power lines got cut first. Real professional job. Pete's voice carried the weight of a man who'd seen too much and could do too little. I got witnesses saw the bikes leaving around midnight, but what, Pete? The sheriff looked at Frank, then at the smoking ruins, then back at Frank. These boys, they're connected. Got lawyers in Phoenix, friends in county. And they left a message. Pete handed Frank a piece of paper, the kind torn from a spiral notebook. For words in block letters, "This ain't your town." Frank read it twice, folded it carefully, and put it in his shirt pocket. Around them, neighbors and business owners stood in small clusters, their faces illuminated by emergency lights and dying flames. Some offered condolences. Others just stared. Frank thanked the fire chief, shook hands with the volunteers who tried to save what couldn't be saved, and walked home as the sun began to rise over the mountains. He had work to do. The insurance adjuster arrived Tuesday morning with a clipboard and the demeanor of a man who'd seen every type of creative arson in his 20-year career. Frank walked him through what remained of the shop, answering questions with the same measured precision he'd once used during military debriefings. "Any idea who might have wanted to do this?" the adjuster asked, photographing the melted cash register. "Can't say for certain." It wasn't a lie. Frank knew who'd done it, but certainty in his world had always required evidence that would hold up under cross-examination. The Hell Runners had been careful, no witnesses, no security footage, nothing but whispered rumors and the smell of gasoline that still lingered in the morning air. By noon, word had spread through Cedar Ridge's small network of coffee shops and grocery store aisles. Frank found himself the center of an uncomfortable spotlight, receiving casseroles and condolences from neighbors who meant well but understood little about the kind of men who settled disputes with matches and accelerant. Sheriff Holbrook stopped by the ruins around 2 o'clock, his patrol car idling while he studied the debris. "Frank, I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear me clear." Frank waited. These boys, they're not just passing through anymore. They're setting up operations, protection rackets, drug distribution, the works. Phoenix PD says they've got a dozen active warrants, but jurisdictional issues keep everything tied up in court. Your point, Pete. My point is that you were military. Special operations, if the rumors are true. And I'm worried you might be thinking about handling this yourself. Frank studied the younger man. Pete Holbrook had been sheriff for 8 years, elected on promises of community policing and transparent government. He was a good man, honest, but he'd never faced the kind of systematic intimidation that turned law-abiding citizens into silent accomplices. "I'm a barber, Pete." Was a barber. "That's not what I asked." Frank picked up a piece of charred wood that had once been part of his grandfather's workbench. The old man had built it in 1952, when Korean War veterans were coming home and needing jobs. 3 generations of Carters had cut hair behind that bench, serving their community with quiet pride. "Sometimes," Frank said, "good men have to make hard choices." Pete's radio crackled with a domestic disturbance call. He climbed back into his cruiser, but rolled down the window before leaving. "Frank, I can't protect you if you go looking for trouble." "Never asked you to." That evening, Frank climbed the pull-down stairs to his attic for the first time in 15 years. Dust motes danced in the light from his flashlight as he navigated between Christmas decorations and boxes of old tax returns. In the far corner, covered by a military surplus tarp, sat a footlocker that hadn't been opened since 1987. The combination lock still remembered his fingers. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were the tools of a different life. Night vision goggles. Tactical knife. Smoke grenades. A radio headset that could reach frequencies most people didn't know existed. And at the bottom, sealed in waterproof containers, were the memories he'd tried hardest to forget. Photographs from Somalia. Medal citations he'd never displayed. Letters from the families of men he'd saved and men he'd failed to save. The weight of 30 years in naval special warfare, distilled into objects that most civilians would never understand. Frank sat on an old milk crate, holding a photo from 1983. 7 men in desert camouflage, their faces young and hard, standing beside a helicopter in some forgotten corner of the Middle East. 3 of them were dead now, 2 from combat, one from the bottle. 2 more had never fully come home, lost in the gray spaces between war and peace. Frank was the only one who'd found something resembling normal life. Marriage, brief but real. A trade that used his hands for creation instead of destruction. A community that respected him without knowing why they should. All of it burned down by men who mistook age for weakness. He packed the tactical gear into a civilian duffel bag, leaving the photographs and citations in the footlocker. Some battles belonged to the past. Others demanded you bring the past forward, ready or not. The next morning, Frank drove to Flagstaff and visited 3 separate sporting goods stores. Camping supplies. Emergency flares. A few items that raised eyebrows but no questions when paid for with cash. On the drive home, memories surfaced unbidden. Cold water off the coast of Alaska, learning to regulate breathing and heart rate while hypothermia tried to shut down his nervous system. The weight of full combat gear during 72-hour exercises where failure meant starting over. The sound of helicopter rotors in the distance, promising extraction for those who could reach the landing zone. Training never leaves the body. It might lie dormant for decades, buried under layers of civilian routine, but it never dies. Frank felt his old reflexes awakening as he planned routes through Cedar Ridge's alleys and side streets, cataloged hiding spots and choke points, remembered lessons learned in places where mistakes had permanent consequences. Tuesday night, he sat in his kitchen and sketched tactical maps on graph paper. Wednesday, he drove to hardware stores in 3 different towns, buying components that meant nothing individually but everything when assembled with the right knowledge. Thursday, he watched the Hell Runners' routine from a distance, noting patterns and vulnerabilities with eyes that had once tracked enemy movements through Mogadishu's labyrinthine streets. By Friday, Frank Carter the barber had prepared for the return of Frank Carter the warrior. The transition felt disturbingly natural, like putting on an old coat that still fit perfectly despite the passing years. Some men retire from war. Others discover that war simply changes address. Saturday morning found Frank installing a new sign where his barbershop had stood. Not a full reconstruction. The insurance settlement wouldn't cover that for months, but a simple wooden placard hammered into the scorched earth, Frank's Barbershop. Reopening soon. The message was tactical rather than commercial. Territory markers matter in every conflict, from jungle warfare to street-level intimidation. Frank wanted the Hell Runners to understand that their arson had been noted but not accepted. He spent the morning sweeping debris and salvaging what could be saved. A few hand tools had survived the fire, their steel handles blackened but functional. The antique cash register was a total loss, but its brass fittings might polish up for display. Small victories, but in Frank's experience, major campaigns were won through accumulation of small victories. Around noon, 3 motorcycles rumbled down Main Street and parked directly in front of the ruins. Frank continued sweeping, his movements unhurried, as 3 Hell Runners dismounted and approached. The lead rider was maybe 45, with a kind of prison yard muscle that came from having nothing to do but lift weights and plan revenge. Tattoos covered his arms like resume entries, tears for victims, skulls for achievements, names and dates that probably meant something to someone. "Old man," the biker said, "you didn't get the message?" Frank leaned the broom against a charred wall post and studied his visitors. The leader stood with his weight forward, ready to charge or retreat. The second man positioned himself at an angle, creating a crossfire of intimidation. The third hung back, probably the lookout or the one designated to run if things went sideways. Standard tactical formation. These weren't random thugs. "I got your message," Frank said. Didn't much care for the delivery method. "Funny man." The leader stepped closer, close enough that Frank could smell leather and motor oil and something else, the metallic scent of a man who'd recently cleaned blood from under his fingernails. "Let me clarify the situation for you. This town belongs to us now. That means businesses pay for protection, and troublemakers find somewhere else to live." "I see." Frank's voice carried no challenge, no fear, just the neutral tone of a man gathering information. "And which category do I fall into?" "That depends. You gonna rebuild this shithole and keep your mouth shut? Or do we need to have this conversation again?" Frank appeared to consider the question seriously. In reality, he was calculating distances and angles, noting that the second man favored his right leg, old injury, possibly a motorcycle accident, and that the lookout kept glancing toward Murphy's Tavern, probably where the rest of the crew was drinking. "I appreciate you taking the time to explain things," Frank said finally. Clear communication prevents misunderstandings. The leader smiled, mistaking diplomacy for capitulation. Smart man. We'll be by next week to discuss protection rates. He turned to leave, and Frank moved. 30 years of muscle memory compressed into 3 seconds. Frank's left hand captured the leader's wrist while his right drove an elbow into the solar plexus. The biker doubled over, gasping, as Frank twisted the captured arm behind his back and applied pressure to the carotid artery. Not enough to cause permanent damage, but sufficient to demonstrate capability. The second man reached for something under his jacket, but Frank was already moving, using the leader's body as a shield while drawing the tactical knife from his belt. The blade appeared at the leader's throat like magic, there one moment, absent the next, present again with no visible transition. Gentlemen, Frank said conversationally, let's avoid any misunderstandings. The lookout had drawn a pistol, but couldn't get a clean shot with his leader held hostage. The second man froze with his hand halfway to his weapon, smart enough to recognize that the situation had shifted beyond his experience level. Here's what's going to happen, Frank continued. You're going to walk back to your bikes. You're going to ride out of town. And you're going to tell your friends that the barber isn't interested in their protection services. You crazy old bastard, the leader wheezed. You have any idea who you're fucking with? Frank increased pressure on the carotid hold, watching the man's knees begin to buckle. I know exactly who I'm dealing with. The question is whether you know who you're dealing with. He released the hold and stepped back, the knife disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. The leader stumbled forward, catching himself against one of the motorcycles while his friends moved to support him. This ain't over, the second man snarled. No, Frank agreed. It's not. The Hell Runners mounted their bikes and roared away, leaving twin trails of burned rubber on the asphalt. Frank watched them go, then resumed sweeping debris as if nothing had happened. But his mind was already 3 moves ahead, planning for the escalation that would inevitably follow. Word spread through Cedar Ridge with the efficiency of a small-town telephone network. By evening, half the population had heard some version of what happened outside the burned barbershop. Details varied. In some tellings, Frank had fought off 6 men. In others, he'd used military weapons. But the core message remained consistent. The quiet barber wasn't quite as helpless as he appeared. That night, Frank sat in his kitchen and checked his equipment one final time. Flares, smoke grenades, tactical radio, night vision gear. Everything a retired SEAL might need to defend civilian territory against organized criminals who'd forgotten that some battles couldn't be won through simple intimidation. Outside, Cedar Ridge slept fitfully, sensing change in the air like animals before a storm. The Hell Runners had made their move, and Frank had responded with measured force. But motorcycle clubs didn't accept humiliation any more than special operations units accepted mission failure. The next phase would determine whether Cedar Ridge remained a place where honest people could live without fear, or became another conquest in the Hell Runners' expanding territory. Frank checked his watch, 23:47 hours. In military time, because old habits died hard and some habits deserved to live forever. The enemy would return. When they did, they'd discover that burning down a barbershop was easy. Taking a town from a Navy SEAL was considerably more difficult. They came on Sunday night, when honest people were home with their families and the streets belonged to shadows and the occasional passing patrol car. 12 motorcycles this time, engines muffled with aftermarket silencers that reduced their signature roar to a predatory whisper. Frank heard them coming from 6 blocks away. He'd been waiting in the ruins of his barbershop since sunset, dressed in dark clothing that made him invisible among the charred beams and debris. Night vision goggles transformed the darkness into green-tinted clarity, revealing every detail of the approaching formation. The Hell Runners were taking this seriously, full battle rattle, with at least 3 men carrying assault weapons and the rest armed with pistols and improvised weapons. Professional criminals, but not professional soldiers. The distinction would matter. Frank keyed his tactical radio, broadcasting on emergency frequencies that Sheriff Holbrook's department monitored. Cedar Ridge has multiple armed suspects converging on Main Street. Recommend civilian shelter-in-place protocols. He didn't wait for acknowledgement. The Hell Runners were spreading out now, surrounding the block where his barbershop had stood. Standard encirclement tactics, designed to prevent escape and eliminate witnesses. They'd probably done this before, in other small towns that couldn't fight back. Cedar Ridge would be different. Frank triggered the first smoke grenade as the lead riders dismounted. White phosphorus billowed across Main Street, creating a fog bank that reduced visibility to arm's length and forced the bikers to navigate by memory rather than sight. In the confusion, Frank moved to his first prepared position, a concealed foxhole he dug behind the hardware store, with clear sightlines down two intersecting alleys. "Where the hell is he?" someone shouted through the smoke. "Spread out. Check every building." Frank waited until 4 hell runners had entered the alley, then triggered a tripwire connected to a flashbang grenade. The explosion strobed through the smoke like lightning, followed by screams and curses as temporarily blinded men stumbled into trash cans and brick walls. He was already moving to position 2. The second grenade went off near Murphy's Tavern, creating another cloud of concealment while Frank circled behind the remaining bikers. 2 of them had taken cover behind their motorcycles, using the machines as improvised fortifications while they tried to spot targets through the chaos. Frank had taught urban warfare to Marine Force recon units. He knew that motorcycles provided psychological comfort but negligible ballistic protection, and that men who relied on intimidation rather than training made predictable mistakes under stress. He low-crawled to within 10 feet of their position, then stood up in their blind spot. "Evening, gentlemen." Both men spun toward his voice, weapons raised, but Frank was already in motion. A tactical baton, improvised from a piece of rebar wrapped with electrical tape, cracked across the first man's wrist, sending his pistol spinning into the darkness. The second managed to squeeze off a wild shot before Frank's knee found his solar plexus and dropped him to the pavement. Neither man was seriously injured, but both would remember this night every time they considered picking up a weapon. "Jesus Christ." The voice came from somewhere in the smoke. "What the hell is this guy?" Frank smiled grimly and moved to position 3. The Hell Runners were regrouping now, their initial confidence shaken by fighting an enemy they couldn't see or predict. Frank counted voices and footsteps, tracking their movement through the smoke while remaining invisible himself. 7 still active, maybe 8. The others were either down or had retreated to regroup. Good. Numbers meant nothing when you controlled the battlefield. Frank triggered another smoke grenade, this one place to drive the remaining bikers toward the ruins of his barbershop. The psychology was important, making them fight on ground of his choosing, in a place that represented their initial victory and his motivation for revenge. They came through the smoke like ghosts, weapons ready, moving with the nervous energy of men who'd realized they were hunting something more dangerous than an elderly barber. Frank waited until they'd committed to entering the ruins, then triggered his final surprise. Emergency flares, planted throughout the debris, ignited simultaneously and turned the destroyed barbershop into a blazing arena. The Hell Runners found themselves illuminated like actors on a stage, their night vision destroyed, their concealment eliminated. Frank, still wearing night vision goggles and positioned outside the light circle, had become the invisible predator. "You wanted my attention," he called out, his voice echoing from multiple directions as he moved between speaking positions. "You have it." 3 muzzle flashes strobed through the smoke as panicked gunfire erupted from the trapped bikers. But they were shooting at shadows and echoes, wasting ammunition while Frank circled behind them with the patience of a man who'd spent decades learning to kill efficiently. The first one never saw him coming. Frank's arm snaked around the biker's throat, applying a sleeper hold that dropped the man unconscious in 8 seconds. The second managed to turn around before Frank's knee found his groin and doubled him over for a follow-up strike to the base of the skull. "He's behind us," someone screamed. Frank was already gone, melted back into the smoke and darkness like a specter. 2 more Hell Runners broke and ran, their motorcycles roaring to life as they fled down Main Street. The remaining 3 clustered together, backs to each other, weapons pointed in all directions. "Come on, old man," one of them shouted. "Let's finish this." Frank stepped into the circle of flare light, hands empty, posture relaxed. The night vision goggles were gone, stored safely away. In the dancing shadows cast by the emergency flares, he looked like exactly what he was, a 63-year-old barber who'd seen too much and lost too much to be intimidated by men who confused cruelty with strength. "Put down the weapons," he said quietly. "Walk away. Don't come back." The lead biker, blood streaming from a broken nose, raised his pistol with shaking hands. "Fuck you, old man. Nobody does this to the Hell Runners." "I just did." The shot came from Frank's right, Sheriff Holbrook, arriving with 2 deputies and a tactical flashlight that cut through the smoke like a sword blade. The biker's pistol flew from nerveless fingers as a .40 caliber round shattered his wrist. Cedar Ridge Sheriff's Department. Drop your weapons. The remaining Hell Runners surrendered with the deflated resignation of men who'd gambled everything on a bluff and lost. As the deputies secured the scene and called for ambulances, Sheriff Holbrook approached Frank through the dissipating smoke. "You okay, Frank?" Frank surveyed the ruins of his barbershop, now doubly destroyed by fire and battle. 7 Hell Runners were down, none permanently injured, but all marked by an encounter they'd never forget. The others had fled, carrying word that Cedar Ridge was no longer easy prey. "I'm fine, Pete. Just some cleanup to finish. I'll write the report." Multiple suspects attempted armed assault on a civilian. Civilian defended himself with reasonable force. Case closed. Frank nodded, understanding the subtext. Some stories were better left simple, especially when the alternative involved explaining how a retired barber had single-handedly defeated a dozen armed criminals using military tactics and improvised weapons. Appreciate it. As the ambulances carried away the wounded and the last Hell Runners were loaded into patrol cars, Frank stood among the ruins of his grandfather's legacy and felt something he hadn't experienced in 30 years. Complete tactical victory. The Hell Runners' MC never returned to Cedar Ridge. Word spread through the criminal networks that connected small-town drug dealers with big-city suppliers. The dusty Arizona town with the burned barbershop was protected by something more dangerous than local law enforcement. Stories grew in the telling, as stories do. Some claimed the old barber had killed half a dozen men with his bare hands. Others insisted he'd used military weapons and explosive devices. A few whispered that he wasn't entirely human, that the government had created super soldiers during the Cold War and hidden them in plain sight. Frank neither confirmed nor denied the rumors. He simply rebuilt his barbershop, this time with better security and a large window that faced Main Street. Etched into the glass, barely visible unless you knew where to look, was the Navy SEAL trident, a small reminder that some victories were worth displaying. The insurance settlement covered most of the reconstruction costs. Community donations handled the rest. Cedar Ridge's citizens might not have understood exactly what had happened that Sunday night, but they recognized protection when they saw it. Frank's calendar filled with appointments from customers who'd never visited before, drawn by curiosity and staying for the quality of the haircuts. Among his regular clients were Tommy Martinez and 3 other local teenagers who'd started showing up on Saturday mornings. Not for haircuts, their hair was fine, but for the informal lessons Frank had begun teaching in the barbershop's back room. "Discipline is about controlling yourself first," Frank explained, demonstrating a basic wrist hold to the attentive teenagers. "If you can't control your own actions, you can't control the situation around you." The boys practiced the techniques with teenage enthusiasm, grateful to have an adult who treated them seriously and taught them skills that might matter someday. Frank kept the lessons simple: basic self-defense, situational awareness, the importance of thinking before acting. He never mentioned his military background directly, but the principles he taught came from 3 decades of experience in places where mistakes had permanent consequences. Sheriff Holbrook stopped by occasionally, ostensibly for haircuts but actually to check on the town's unofficial guardian. The 2 men had developed an understanding based on mutual respect and shared commitment to protecting what mattered. "Any word from Phoenix PD about our motorcycle friends?" Frank asked during one such visit, trimming the sheriff's gray sideburns with practiced precision. Hell Runners MC officially disbanded last month. Remaining members scattered to other clubs or went independent. Pete studied Frank's reflection in the mirror. Amazing how quickly things can change.